Welcome to Democratic Television, a program of the Santa Clara County Democratic Party that brings insights, perspectives, and attitudes of our always thoughtful Democratic guests. Our focus today is on state legislative races and local government, and our guest is Shelly Masur. She's the Redwood City Council member and a candidate for California State Senate in District 13. Shelly, welcome and thank you for being on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So before we get into your Senate campaign, I'd like to give you an opportunity to share with users a bit about what brought you to public life, because it's hard work and it's a loss of privacy and a big commitment, and not everybody chooses to do it. But what would you say about your background and your life brought you to a place where you stepped into public life?
Yeah, well, I really got my start when I was organizing around women's health and reproductive rights. So you may remember when women's health clinics used to be physically under attack on a regular basis.
Right.
And so I was one of those people who would put my body in between the protesters and the women who sought health care.
Right.
And that was really my entree into like organizing and political activism. I did that for many years and actually ended up getting a master's in public health so that I could then work in reproductive health, which I did for a long time. But really what happened is, so I had learned the importance, I had learned the importance of elected officials in that. And
right. Was that like college days, or how did you come to be involved in that work? Because it was a very confrontational part of public life. It was a very, that was quite a conflict, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was actually. Yeah, I mean, it was actually physical, like people physically pushing each other. But
yes.
You know what happened is I just got a flyer, and I felt really strongly. I was living in LA at the time. And I felt really strongly about women having access to reproductive health care, particularly abortion services. And so I just showed up for a training.
Wow.
And got really involved. The Fund for the Feminist Majority was organizing it in LA at the time.
Wow.
And so I would go almost every weekend on Saturday mornings, and then during the weekdays, I would go to the fund's offices and make phone calls for fundraising and getting volunteers out to help do that.
Wow. It's interesting how something that one it resonates, that you really care about, it can draw you in, the different volunteer opportunities and ways of being involved.
Yeah, and actually, I don't know if you know this, I know you know my husband, but that's how my husband and I met.
Really?
Yeah.
Did that work?
Yeah, because I moved to New York, and during the '92 Democratic National Convention, there were attacks on women's health clinics in New York.
Right.
I, again, got a flyer and showed up for a training. It turned out it was the same people from LA who had been organizing in LA that were in New York. So we knew each other, so that was kind of great.
Wow.
And he had been doing that work through a New York-based organization. So at the end of the week, we met. We'd been separated because I'd been sort of roving all over the city, and he had been in one place. And as he always says, they were doing such a good job protecting their clinics. I never had to show up where he was.
Right.
But yeah, that's how we met.
Fascinating. So that's that effort. That was really so successful. From the legal victory in Roe v. Wade to defending that as a practical reality, extending those rights throughout the country. And I know for many, I think complacency may not be quite the right word, but we got to a place where we felt more secure in those rights. And for me, one of the saddest turn of events of this current presidency is what's happened with the judiciary and how it's emboldened folks to really try to undermine access to reproductive rights. And I suppose it's just one of those battles that we are unfortunately going to have to keep fighting in different forms over time. Yeah,
and I think you're right, and I don't think it's been intentional, but I think it's been people just sort of assumed it was a settled law, right?
Yes.
And so, and particularly for younger women who hadn't had to either live through the time pre-Roe, when women were dying from illegal abortions, or in that sort of activism after Roe that continued up into the 90s because we had several court cases in the early 90s, at the Supreme Court that threatened it. And then it sort of quieted down. But I think, I was recently at an event that NARAL, the National Abortion Rights and Reproductive Action League, NARAL Pro-Choice California put on, and they were talking about two things. One, an effort that they're doing to have corporations sign on to a statement of support for reproductive rights and access to abortion care. It's great. I think they have about 300 corporations signed on now. But the other thing is they talked about how they're assuming that Roe is going to be overturned.
Right.
At this point, the assumption is it will be overturned. It's going to go back to the states. And then we're going to see things like Alabama, which has fully outlawed abortion.
Not only just outlawing doing abortions in Alabama, but making it illegal for women to leave their state to get an abortion and come back. And that can't be constitutional even under a post-Roe regime. But the problem is, where would you find the right,
Well, also, I guess the way I think about it too is like, what are they going to do?
Right.
How are they going to know?
Yes.
If you get a positive pregnancy test, you're not allowed to leave the state until the baby's born. I mean, it's a pretty
hard to see how
ridiculous.
How privacy could be respected to any degree in that regime.
Or just practically, even, right? Like there's the legal question, but there's the practical question as well.
Yes. So that's I guess a whole and very complicated issue. It's also sort of a national level issue, and I know that that your service to date has been on local issues, and that's a very common place to start. So how did you go from that activism to an opportunity to enter public life?
Well, when my daughter entered kindergarten, we were living in Mountain View, and her school was ranked pretty low. You know, we used to rank schools 1 to 10, as you may remember. Her school was like a 1 or a 2. And so I didn't like some of the decisions the school board was making in an attempt to improve the school. So I took my little organizing background and helped organize parents, and we would go to school board meetings and sort of yell at the school board. And one of the school board members is still on the board now, and I reminded her, I'm like, remember when I used to come and yell at you?
Right.
But I spent a lot of time there.
Aren't you worried about karma? I mean, it's like having in public life now when people show up and are giving you trouble. Don't
it's happened.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, 14 years in local elected service, there's been a lot of contentious meetings, shall we say.
Right, I'm sure.
But
what's an example of an issue or that you organized around as a parent before you came into your own public service?
Well, I mean, the board, you know, the district was making changes in, you know, class configuration and things like that, and it was things that we felt were upsetting the sort of continuity for kids. So, but what happened was I was there so much. I was also working in comprehensive sex ed and teen pregnancy prevention. So whenever they were discussing their sex ed policy, I would show up at the meetings as well.
Subject matter as well.
I did learn how public meetings work at that time, because instead of yelling out from the back, hey, this is what the law says, they'd be like, could you please fill out a card and come and testify?
Speak for 1 minute
Please
or 3
stop
minutes.
yelling at us from the back of the room. So that was good training for me.
Sure.
But I was there so much that when one of the board members decided not to run again, she said, you think you know everything? You need to run. And we had just sold our house in Mountain View. So I didn't know where we were going to buy a new house, so I couldn't run at that time. But that was 2004. We moved to Redwood City right after the election in 2004. The reason that's significant is Ira Ruskin got elected to the assembly that year.
Yes.
And he was elected from the Redwood City Council.
Right.
So the council appointed somebody to fill his seat.
Right.
She was a school board member. And so I read an article that there was an opening on the school board, and I said, you know, I'm going to apply. They won't appoint me because we're brand new to Redwood City.
Right.
But at least I'll have them at the board and the superintendent. So when I have a problem, maybe they'll answer my phone calls or, you know, my emails or whatever.
Right.
But I actually got appointed.
Wow.
So about 3 months after we moved to Redwood City, I was appointed to the Redwood City School Board, and then had to run in the next regular election, which was that November.
Wow. It's two things come to mind. One is that young people getting involved, and I consider anybody with kids of school age to be young, is it can be hard because in our area housing is so expensive and jobs are so ephemeral that there's a lot of movement. And in the past, I think, I don't know how long Ira Ruskin lived in Redwood City before he was a city council member, but it used to be easier, I think, for people to have longevity in one place, and you do have to have some kind of ties to your local community to have something to contribute. But you had kids in school, and that's an important thing, I think, for school board. So what did you find, did you see any big differences in the way parents and advocates interacted with the Redwood City School Board as compared to your experience in Mountain View, or was it very similar?
It was pretty similar. I mean, at that time, you know, there was just a lot of turmoil. Schools have been perpetually underfunded in California since Prop 13, as you know.
Yes, it's a problem.
And so funding is always an issue. The district was had a lot of challenges at that time. We lost a parcel tax just a month or so after I joined the board, and so people were worried about the budget and budget cuts. There was a lot of there were a lot of issues to solve, and so I sort of entered in a very tumultuous time.
Sounds like it. Yeah, had to jump right in, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was many different issues, but I think the good thing is that because I had to run in the next regular election, I had to go out and listen to the community and understand what they thought, what they heard, and what they knew. And so that was really helpful. And then ended up serving 10 years on that board.
Wow.
So I served during the recession, which was tough.
That was another hard time, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the funding challenges that were presented.
Yeah, and so to your point about young families, so when I started on that board, my boys I have twin boys. They were 4, and my daughter was 7. So they entered kindergarten right after I started on the board. And so they, I always say that for my kids and kids who went through public school at that time, they kind of got the worst of public education because we had terrible funding due to the recession.
Right.
And we had No Child Left Behind looming over us. And so we constrained curriculum so that it was really just math and English, very focused. Lots of kids lost out on things like art and music and PE and social studies, which I consider basic science also.
Yeah. And social studies, one of the things that's wrapped up in that, of course, is civics. You know, now people complain that they don't think young people have enough formal training in civics. And I think that the curriculum now includes more of that. And of course, a lot of the young people are very active and care about the climate, and they care about a lot of things in our society. So their activism is certainly important. Well, when you were on, so you were in a pretty rough time in city council and kind of in school board for kind of a good long time. One thing I'm always amazed about school board members, especially parent school board members, of course, they have a lot invested, they have a lot of connection to the schools through their kids, but they also have kids at home, and that must be a really hard thing to do, to serve under those like difficult times, because board meetings go longer when it's hard to make priorities, like when we've got limited resources and we're trying to decide which of the things we love we're going to cut.
Right.
That can be pretty hard. How did you manage that? I mean, what advice would you have for others who might say, I don't want to work for school board because it'd be
it's too hard.
It'd be too hard on top of everything else, right?
I think it's like anything in public life. And actually, I was just speaking to a group of women lawyers yesterday about this exact issue.
Yeah.
I was fortunate because my husband had a fairly flexible hours at his job, and so he was able to be around in the evenings and sort of, he's a good cook.
Yeah,
I'm not a good cook, so that was good. So, he was the person who could make them dinner and be home and help them with their homework, et cetera.
Right.
And I had a relatively flexible job too. I worked full time, but I had a flexible job, and so I could sometimes be home in the afternoons. But, what was critical, and this is what I think we need to consider for everybody, is after school care. Being able to have after school care on site at our school made a huge difference for me. Yeah, so we need to make sure that we protect programs like that for working families, because to your point, it's very expensive to live here. And you generally have two income couples, right? Just in order to barely afford a house or an apartment in this area.
And of course, the research and evidence shows how important it is for kids to be well supported in those early years too.
Exactly. So those kinds of things were very helpful. I sort of shifted my work from public health into public education while I was a school board member.
Right.
So that also
gained more expertise in that way as well.
I gained more expertise, but I also could sort of overlap work that I was doing on behalf of the school district, and then work that I was doing for my job. So it was just I was in a fortunate situation.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I'm sure it'll be instructive for others. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll talk a bit about City Council and your campaign.
Hi, I'm State Senator Bob Wykowski, and I'm representing Santa Clara and Alameda County. And I urge each and every one of you to get involved with the Democratic Party. There's things that we can do right now with so many folks that are having a difficult time making it. I've introduced a packet of bills that I'm calling economic equality and financial stability. Democratic Party talks about the income inequality, the growing gap between folks, and I've got a packet of bills that's going to help the working person retain more of the wages that they earn. If they're faced with a bankruptcy at least have a fresh start to keep some assets. And also, if you received the judgment that it's not your judgment, making it easier for you to undo it. You can make a difference. You can contact me or contact any of your legislators and get involved in the Democratic Party. We need your help. We need young people to come forward. We need everyone to come forward to fight for those who unfortunately cannot take care of themselves and need not a handout, but a hand boosting them up. Again, my name is Bob Wykowski. I'm your state senator. Get involved and let's help out the California Democratic Party.
Welcome back. We're going to continue our conversation with Redwood City Council member and state Senate candidate Shelly Masur. Shelly, we talked a bit about school board and your start in public life already. At what point did you make the transition to city council?
So in 2015, my kids had all graduated out of the K-8 district. We had a balance of parents and non-parents on our board, and I thought that was a good balance. So I wanted to make space for a parent to run and serve on that board. So I decided not to run, and had a few people call me and ask if I would consider running for city council, at which I first said no, but I obviously changed my mind since we're sitting here.
Right.
And yeah, I just thought that it was important to have somebody who had understanding and experience and wanted to keep schools at the forefront. As probably many of the people watching this know, Redwood City is rapidly developed, and I wanted to make sure that schools and kids were considered as that development continued.
Right. Well, that's a great thought. You know, the change and the pace of change has been hard for a lot of communities. What are the challenges that, as a council member, you've seen your council have to confront?
Yeah, I mean, it really is that rate of change, and I think when you run for office, you think you can do a lot more than you can do. In some way, it sounds a little bit odd, but you know, a couple of things. One is you know, you have to get a majority to vote if you're going to do anything.
Right.
You can't do anything by yourself. You're part of a team, and if the majority of your team doesn't want to do it, it's not going to happen.
Right.
And two, there's a lot of, and we saw this increase this year at the state legislature, there's a lot of legal issues around when you can approve development, when you can't disapprove development. You know, there's just a lot of stuff that I didn't know. But I think for our community, it's just been hard because it is a whole different city. As I said earlier, I moved there in 2004, and what it looked like then and what it looks like now, it's just a different place.
Right. You know, it has kind of an old downtown, which is interesting because not all of the cities around here really kept their downtowns, and some of the cities are even younger. And but I know that there's some tech companies that are based there now as well.
Yeah.
So that brings a lot of change.
Yeah. Well, we've had Oracle for a long time, but that's out in Redwood Shores. But we do have Box downtown, and we do have a lot of new tech companies moving in, and as well as law firms and other companies that decide to locate in Redwood City. They like our downtown is pretty vibrant at this point. We have lots of good restaurants, so it's a good place to be.
Yes, it sounds like it. How about housing and transportation and traffic? Are those issues? Most of the communities in the Bay Area have really struggled with those. And what's that look like in Redwood City?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
It's a Bay Area problem. What did you? I think we all saw this stat a few weeks ago that the Bay Area has the second worst traffic in the country behind LA. Did you see that?
Yes, I know. We can no longer be in LA denial about our traffic.
No. I think Seattle had been ahead of us for a while, but now we've surpassed Seattle. So yes, of course, traffic and transportation is a huge issue.
Right.
And housing as well. The cost of housing, we talked about it earlier.
Yeah.
I always talk about my daughter, who is a teacher, first-year teacher. She's a teacher in Redwood City, make $53,000 a year, which sounds like a good salary, but in San Mateo County, it qualifies you for very low-income housing.
Right.
So we really have a lot of work to do. So Redwood City's built a lot of housing. We've built a lot of market rate housing. My predecessors really set in place a good framework for that to happen. And I think the majority of my council is very committed to making sure that we continue to do our part to address the housing crisis. So we have done, I think we've built 4,000 units or so of market rate housing, but where we really need to continue to do work is in our affordable housing. And so we're working on that in Redwood City. But
right. So affordable housing is sort of where the schools are in the sense that we have this paradox in California of being such a wealthy state and really, equivalent to a wealthy country. in terms of the economy of the state. And yet we have a large population and a very diverse and complicated population. And we do seem to be losing ground both in the schools in terms of our investment and affordable housing. And so I guess fast forward to running for state senate, are there things you think the state could do or should do and that would help to address these issues at the state level?
Well, so education, let's start with that.
Sure.
Because in a way it's kind of easier, even though it's pretty complex. And we sit in somewhere in the 40s every year in education funding as compared to other states.
Right, down there with Mississippi and places that
Yeah.
we make fun of, right? As being more backward than California.
Yeah, and in the 5th largest economy in the world, that just shouldn't be the case. We really should be in the top 10. And before Prop 13, we were in the top 10. So I think we need to, so we have a ballot initiative that is being circulated that would reform the commercial property tax loophole for Prop 13. It would bring in about $11 billion a year, distributed as property taxes are currently distributed with some specific set aside for schools, and particularly low-income schools. So I think that's a start for addressing the funding issue.
That measure, to me, one interesting aspect of it is I think that the messaging and framing of the issue has gotten better from those of us who agree that that's a good plan, because there was the shorthand that policy wonks used to use for it was split roll. Like you would treat commercial properties differently than residential properties. And I think that the solution that's being proposed by that initiative, it's a little more nuanced than that, and I think it's also being framed more accurately as a question of paying everyone's fair share to invest in the state.
Yeah, and it's called schools and communities first, right? That we have to consider the needs of our schools and communities first.
Right.
And so I think that's one thing that will help us address our education funding issue. So that's one piece of education. And then on housing, well, of course, the state had over 200 bills on housing this year.
Right, so obviously it's recognized as a hot issue, right?
Wide range, and I think, of course, the most controversial bill was SB 50, Senator Wiener's bill.
Right, and solutions like that. You alluded to earlier, there have been some steps in that direction. And what I see in my role as party chair is tension between very strong pro-housing, pro-community local government leaders who want to maintain their level of control and who feel their constituents expect them to do that, and the state leaders who just look at the numbers and realize that every year we get further and further behind, and they see the need to do something more dramatic. And the balance, I guess, is what people are struggling to find.
Yeah. Well, the proposal I've made to modify SB 50 to try and strike that balance is that, so a big component of that was requiring cities to approve all developments that were within a half a mile of transit and a fixed transit. So it would be trains or ferries or bus routes that went that came every 10 minutes in both directions. So it's kind of limited. We don't have a lot of great bus service like that.
Right.
But my proposal was that give cities a limited amount of time to do their own plan that achieves those goals.
Right.
So they had some time to talk to their community about what would it look like for our community, how would we do it, and if they don't do it within that time, then the provisions.
Bring the hammer down.
Well, then
It's
the
like a
provisions
backstop.
of SB 50 would kick in. Yeah, but it gives you an opportunity to have that community conversation and sort of say, we recognize that we need to be building housing around transit.
Right.
But let's talk about how we want to structure it in our town. And so I've actually talked to Senator Wiener about that. He's supporting me in this race.
Good, fabulous.
So thank you. And so he's willing to entertain a change like that. Another thing that happened in that bill, sort of through the process, was smaller counties under 600,000 in population were generally exempted. And the governors said we need 3.5 million new homes.
Right.
And that would have put it all on 15 counties in the state to build.
Right. Yeah, it's hard. How do you get there if you're not building in some new places?
Right. So I was not in favor of that exemption. Most of them are going to be naturally exempted out in terms of the transit piece, but there's some components that would have applied to them, and I think they need to be a part of the solution as well.
Right. Well, what do you see about the dynamic in Sacramento? And you imagine you've been studying how things get done there, and what do you think of that, and how do you feel you'll be able to make an impact there?
I think like a lot of things, politics is about relationships, right? And so people have different relationships in Sacramento and are able to get things moving, both because it's a good policy idea and because they've been able to build the coalitions and support that they need to build.
Right.
So I think a lot of my experience as a local elected has been actually spending time in Sacramento working with our legislators, advocating for things that I cared about: public education, reproductive health, housing, other issues that face cities. And so I've had a great opportunity to be an advocate from a local elected position. And I think now what I'd love to do is translate that into being the policymaker. But reaching back into our local communities to work with local communities to understand what's the legislation that will help make a difference in people's lives. And then, but I'm pretty practical too. So, what's practical and how do we move things forward in a way that really helps our state?
Right. What would you say would be your top priorities? What would you try to do first? Yeah. You have that picked out already, or?
People always ask that question, and I always say, I don't know what the legislative environment's going to be like.
Yeah.
And, hopefully I'll be sworn in December of 2020, but I don't know what we're going to need. If the Schools and Communities First initiative doesn't pass, I think we're going to need to address the education funding issue. So that would be something I'd want to address. We've tried to lower the percentage that it requires to pass a local parcel tax for years. Senator Simitian introduced it, and Senator Hill has taken it up. Still didn't pass this year. If it's still not passed, I'll reintroduce it.
Fabulous.
Things like that. I don't know where we're going to be on healthcare. I have a master's in public health, so access to high quality healthcare for everyone is really important to me.
Right.
How we expand access in California and fight back against the Trump administration.
That'll be pretty important.
Yeah.
If folks want to learn about your campaign or reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
Probably the best way is through my website, which is just www.shellymasur, M-A-S-U-R. It's probably written, hopefully.
Yes.
.com.
Very good.
And there's a little contact us tab, and people can reach out. We'll get the email, and I or one of my campaign staff will get back to you.
Fabulous. Well, good luck out there on the campaign trail.
Thank you.
And thank you for this conversation.
Appreciate you having me.
Yes. Thank you for watching DTV. Give us a call at 408-445-9500 or visit our website at www.sccdp.org. Help us to make a difference. We will see you on the campaign trail.